everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Fearcast. This is the podcast dedicated to OCD and anxiety spectrum disorders and getting your life back. I'm your host, Kevin Foss, and I'm a licensed therapist specializing in OCD and anxiety disorders. And thank you all for joining me for this episode today. I hope everybody out there is doing well. For those of you who are new to the podcast, this is a question and answer based podcast. You can send me questions about OCD and anxiety and recovery and how to help other people and how to help yourself or your loved one or something like that. And I will read the question, consider it, and likely put it up on a future episode as I'm doing today. So we've got some really fun episodes coming up, as I've mentioned before. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to have John Hirschfield and Dr. Caitlin Pinciati up, and they're going to be talking about some research that Dr. Pinciati has put out about OCD across the country. I just had a chat with her this morning about it, and it's going to be super interesting. This is really interesting research that she's put out, so I'm really excited to have them on to chat about that. So check in on that, and there'll be other interviews coming up soon. So, but as always, the Fearcast what it primarily is question and answers. So if you have questions, this podcast runs on questions. As I said before, I'm going to do this until I run out of questions, and then I'll figure out something else to do with my life. But until then, I'm going to keep doing this until I stop getting questions, but send in your questions. So you can go over to fearcastpodcast.com and you can send me a message over there. You can also send me a message over at Instagram. I'm Fearcast Podcast. Send in your audio question over there. The audio questions will go to the tippity top of the list and be recorded at that next episode. It will become the next episode. There's a new feature. If you go to fearcastpodcast.com, on the upper right of the page, there'll be this little button there that'll say record. All right. It's a SpeakPipe is what the app is or the feature is. But you can record directly through the website. Click on that. It'll ask you to give your browser permission to your microphone if you haven't done it already. And then you'll just record it and it will email that audio directly to me. So you don't have to join Instagram if you don't want to. You can just go directly through fearcastpodcast.com. I'll get that question and I'll put that up on a future episode. So that is something super fun that is going to be that is now available. So go check that out. But until then, we've still got a bunch of questions to go over. So why don't we just jump right into those without having to go through any other stuff? Y'all don't need to hear about more of my life or ridiculousness other than kids getting started in school. The benefit of that, I said I wasn't going to do it, but here I go. The benefit of that, I have not had a Monday morning off in 7 years since my oldest was born. I'm with the kids on Monday. I watch them all day. But now they're both in school. I have like 5 hours in the morning to figure out what to do with my life, to do whatever I want. So what it's turned into is a bunch more yard work. But either way, it's messing up my schedule and it's messing it up in a very good way. So I'm excited for that. All right, why don't I just jump right into this? So we got two questions today. One is going to be relatively short, but the other one, that's where we're going to spend most of our time. So we'll start out with the short one. So the first one comes from Zach. Zach asks, does false memory OCD always have to appear in a, quote, what if format? Or can it simply be presented as something that is true? So this is a great question. Awesome question. So most often, whenever I'm talking about OCD and trying to teach folks about OCD, and I talk about it here, we talk about the obsession being this what if or if then type of thought. And I try to use the question, or I try to use this statement, OCD tends to show up as, or often shows up as. I probably slip and say it does show up as, but the obsession can also absolutely show up as a what if. It can absolutely also show up as a statement of fact. It says, this is true about you. It says, you are dangerous. You are gay. You are a danger to your child. You don't love your partner, right? You would be better off with somebody else. Right? Your life is, going to be terrible if blank happens or when blank happens, whatever it is. So yes, it can absolutely show up as that. But ultimately, we want to think about this is that the obsession is showing up as a statement, as an idea, as a suggestion as to what life could be like, what may be true, what could be true. And with the statement of it is this, or a statement presented as fact, it still is presenting something that sounds like it's a danger, but it doesn't seem to kind of mesh with who you are, right? It's not who you're trying to be. It's not what your life is about. It's not what you believe to be true about you or your world or your future or anything like that. And it feels often weird, but it still serves the same function. It prompts you to fight it, right? It prompts you to disprove it. It prompts you to protect yourself from it, right? To make sure that it's not true, to make sure that that story or that statement of fact doesn't become true or isn't continuing to be true, whatever the perception is, and or to just to simply feel better, right? Get that anxiety to go away, right? So however it presents itself, it still presents itself as this statement that isn't consistent with who you are or what you want out of your life. And if it still follows that same cycle, right? Obsessive statement, this is feared story, right? If this feared story is, you are actually trans and you're not the cisgendered individual that you think that you are, that might prompt anxiety for you. Go, oh my gosh, what does this mean about me? What's going to happen? I don't want this. And then it causes you to give into compulsion, to try to prove it, to disprove it, whatever it might be. Prove that you are who you think you are. Reinforces the cycle and you're off to the races. So however it presents itself, if it follows that same process and you're still giving it compulsive behaviors, well, it's still the same sort of thing. But to answer your question, yeah, Zach, it can totally show up as a statement of fact. Doesn't mean that it is a fact, but it shows up as a statement of fact. All right, so let's get on to Ellie's question. So Ellie says, I feel like I don't have quite a grasp on this, or I do feel like I don't have a grasp on this. My 14-year-old has a fear of becoming like other people. There are a few actual people who trigger him, but when he has worked hard, but he has worked hard and can be around them with only slight anxiety. The intrusive thoughts will still bug him so much, though. Other than exposing himself to those people who he now basically is okay with, how do we do ERP? How do we help him when he is, quote, stuck? For example, he will still have the thoughts of becoming like other people, and while walking through a door, and have to wait until his thoughts are better. He does okay while doing ERP purposefully, but in a real life situation, he still has a very hard time. So, Ellie, this is a great question. I appreciate that, and I'm so sorry to hear your kiddo is struggling with that. It's awful to see. It's awful to see your kids going through anxiety and stress and stuff. That, I tell this to my kids, and I'll say it, and I'm sure other parents out there too. If I could take on the pain and discomfort of my kids, I would. And that's also, and this is not the case for you, Ellie, but this is also the motivator for a lot of people to do, accommodating behaviors for their family members and loved ones, right? So that's a whole separate conversation. I don't need to get into that. We don't need to get into that. All right. So Ellie, what do you do with this? So what you're talking about here is I'm not saying really common. It's common. I see it. It's where people can do treatment. They do all the stuff. They're in the office and things are fine, I guess, but in real life, when it comes up naturally, as it were, a natural exposure, right? A natural trigger, it can feel overwhelming, like it's brand new, right? So this sort of thing does happen, and what we want to do with that is to also really build up the awareness of what's happening throughout your day, and to really build up those tools to managing anxiety and discomfort and those triggers as much as we possibly can. Also knowing that triggers are going to come up. So the bulk of the conversation I'm going to have today it will include this, but it will also mainly be on the topic of emotional contamination. So you didn't label this obsession in this OCD subtype, but for those who are listening, those who may be struggling with this is a subtype of OCD that we call emotional contamination. And it's similar to, quote, regular contamination, in the sense that, with regular contamination, the person may be worried about taking on some type of substance and it having some sort of effect on them, which may cause an effect on somebody else, and having unwanted consequences to them, right? I know that's such a broad way to say that. But if we think about emotional contamination, the way that we typically would describe this is that the emotional contaminant is oftentimes a characteristic of another person, or a feeling that they get related to this other person, or a fear of becoming this other person in some sort of way. Now, again, there's a ton of magical thinking when it comes to this, a ton of superstition that comes in with this, and I want to talk about that in just a moment. But with emotional contamination, people are concerned about usually individuals who display or have this characteristic that they just desperately don't want. Sometimes it's going to be someone who's lazy or angry, or they're mean, or they can be a bad dresser. I've certainly worked with it in the past where folks are worried that they're going to become, quote, unintelligent like somebody else that they know or in class or something like that. It can be, I'm worried that I'm going to become like my parent, or I'm going to become like my sibling in some of these very specific ways. Now, there's a ton of avoidance and a ton of things that happen in relation to this that that we want to look at. But again, there's as I mentioned, there's a heavy emphasis on magical thinking. I found this quote from an IOCDF article on it. I'm just going to read it here. It says, "The person with OCD often believes that random events and coincidences never occur, and that all events are meant to happen. So they therefore hold special meaning and power. Anytime a coincidence occurs, the sufferer uses the coincidence as, quote, factual evidence that their superstitious beliefs have merit and that all others who try to dissuade them are wrong." So it's kind of this idea. Now, so remember when we talk about OCD, there's this big OCD cycle, right? And there's this, neutral, internal triggers, external triggers, right? Stuff that we see, stuff that we hear, stuff that we think, stuff that we feel, etc., right? Internals and externals, right? All those being neutral. The other person is neutral. The characteristic they have is just the characteristic that they have. But it can start this obsessive thought. Gosh, what if you take on that characteristic? What if you become like that person? What if you become that person? And that characteristic that person has is antithetical to the individual who has that fear. And they're going to go, oh my God, I don't want to have that thought. I don't want that to be me. How do I get rid of this? How do I do that? How do I ensure that I'm me forever, right? So they're going to do whatever they can to try to get rid of that fear, to try to feel more confident again, to get certainty that they are themselves and they will not turn into that other person, right? This can be exhausting. I just want to go over kind of a list. This is not an exhaustive list either. I know when I put together these lists and I talk about them, they are not exhaustive lists. Inevitably, this is the hard part about doing this podcast. Inevitably, I'm going to try to put something together, and then someone out there, maybe this is just my brain coming up with this. This is the reality too. This is the reality. Someone else out there is going to go, well, that ain't me. You missed it, or you missed something. Anyways, that's just more of my anxieties. All right. Here we go. There's a ton of compulsions that are about this. So let's go through some of these. So avoiding that person, pretty simple, right? Avoiding that person. If I'm not around that person, I'm not thinking about that person, I'm not going to become that person, right? Their stank is not going to get on me. Their contamination is not going to get on me. Avoiding places where this person goes, right? So if I'm not around them, their contaminants can't be around me. I can't run into them, bump into them, and I'm not going to be reminded of that person, right? Their germs aren't going to get on or near me. Avoiding contact with items they've contacted, right? So there's a ton of cross-contamination and wet paint that's very common within emotional contamination. It's very elaborate, right? It can be the essence of something, the idea of something, the color of something that, gosh, this person really liked red, so I'm not going to touch red stuff. Right? It can be as simple as that. But really, we would go back to it. I know I'm getting ahead of myself, and I'm jumping away from this the compulsions part of this. It's this idea that, like, if I engage this item, it's going to come onto me, and it's going to infect me and change me. Well, I don't like that. Let me avoid this thing entirely. When I avoid this thing, I'm safe, right? It's keeping me safe from becoming this, quote, bad person, this not me person, this this version of me that could be, but I don't want it to be. So how do I avoid that as much as I can, right? So let's see here. Contact items. Avoiding, actions, places, or items that are related to things that person does. Reassurance seeking, right? Asking friends, family members, etc. Like, hey, have you seen any changes differently? Or it can be outright like, hey, am I more like Bob now? Right? Whatever it may be. It can be very direct. It can be having a good thought when being near or being near them or being or near related items. It's kind of like what Ellie was talking about. Mentally reviewing their past and comparing their personal characteristics to that of the other person, right? It's kind of evaluating their own set of characteristics, their own traits, etc., that they value and say, have I ever, or am I currently, or have I in the past been like this person in some sort of way? Right. Looking for confirming behaviors in self and contrasting them with others. Right. So similarly, a person with emotional contamination may really kind of pay attention to what they are doing and really try to hang their hat on those characteristics, right? Like, I do this. And it's kind of reassuring, right? I do this, man, I'm not like Bob, right? I'm not going to be like that person because I do this in this way, or I wasn't near this person, or I'm going to be okay. Right. Another one, there can be a lot of cleansing or kind of undoing rituals, right? So let's say, like with this, right, with the example from that Ellie gave, right, her son, if he has a bad thought and tries to go through a door, well, he's got to sit there and have a good thought before he goes through the door, right? Sometimes there may be a lot of hand washing, a lot of showering, a lot of washing of clothes that's going to be about that, right? If they were near this person, they want to make sure that everything's clean. I've heard folks will not drive in the same car as a sibling they're worried about. They will, they can't sit in the same place, can't sit in the same seat as the other person or the other person had ever sat in, right? There can become like their seat in the house if they're trying to avoid becoming like a sibling or a parent or family member, whoever it might be, right? So obviously, all these compulsions can really escalate and start taking over someone's life in really terrible ways. You can think about, as it progresses, it can result in people quitting their jobs just to avoid being near somebody. Right. Similarly, someone can change majors or even drop out of college entirely for avoiding being, in the same academic building as that person, just being associated with the idea of that person, or the potential that they might fall into similar career paths. So it might shift over from something they love doing into something that feels, quote, safe that they don't really love, but in the service of that obsession. Right. Somebody might avoid avoid driving where they may come across street names or remind them of somebody, right? It can be as extreme as that, right? They're just going like, I'm not going to drive anymore because I don't want to run across streets that remind me of Bob in any sort of way, right? Bob was really into fishing and there's Fish Road over there, so I'm not going to go over there. This gets elaborate. I'm kind of making stuff up with this, but you can kind of see where it can just get as minute as possible, right? People can even struggle with walking or moving in a natural sort of way out of fear that they might start walking like that other person, right? And it can get as into the minutia as possible, right? So, covering one's head because they're afraid that, they might develop a hair problem, and they believe that the other person has a hair problem, so they don't want to, so they're going to wear a hat to protect their head. So these are, subtle things that I'm changing about other folks that I've worked with, but you can kind of get the idea. So it slowly starts to break someone's life down. All right. So as we're starting to work with someone with this, oftentimes, because I'm a CBT and exposure and response prevention leaning therapist, there are, cognitive distortions and alternative thought orchids as part of cognitive restructuring that we may want to consider in treatment. Now, what this ultimately is doing is from a CBT perspective, we're trying to challenge the way the person thinks about themselves, about the obsession, about their life, etc., to see if there is more evidence that speaks to their fear or more evidence that speaks against their fear. Kind of the idea is that if we can help them to challenge their thoughts and to think differently about themselves or their fear, maybe they'd be willing to do something about it. And that's it's a strong leg up into doing exposure and response prevention. But for some folks, well, let's just kind of go over what some of this could look like, right? So for some of it might be asking this person like, hey, deep down, do you really believe that other people turn into other people? I know it's such a simple question, but, deep down, not what does the OCD say? And even further to build on that, do you have any evidence of one person who was, in one way, suddenly flipping and becoming entirely different, right? Not they changed their hair or they wore different glasses, right? But, they were an extremely lazy person and they became a really hardworking person, or vice versa. They were really hardworking and they became the other way, right? Where are these examples in their life? And now some of this can help and break down some of this, but also you can fall into a trap with this because inevitably we can come up with stories. These may be tangential stories of people changing or becoming different or having something happen. The ICBT folks out there are going to identify, that these are, hearsay stories like this. Hey, I watched a news story where this person got bonked in the head and all of a sudden they became this different person. So therefore they could become this person. Or this person started to hang out with, maybe they say, well, I have a friend of a friend who started hanging out with, quote, the bad crowd at school, and they all of a sudden started to steal and become this bad person, and maybe they could be this bad person, right? So you can fall into this trap where you're now trying to prove and disprove to this person that, they are going to be themselves forever. It's a trap because there is part of us that does go through seasons. We do shift and change. We can grow in one ways and we can shift away from others and grow into other areas of our life. We're not these stagnant people, right? But all of that doesn't really speak to the core of what this person often is. And again, someone out there is going, well, that's not my core fear. And that's fine. You can write me an email, a strongly worded email. I'm fine with that. But it's oftentimes it's going to be this fear of well, what if I become this person that I'm not? Right? I like this person that I am. What if I become somebody I don't like? What if I become something bad? And whatever bad or unwanted means, right? And it's this kind of ambiguous, amorphous, existential fear that someone is really struggling with and having to sit with. And that's ultimately what we're trying to get at, is sitting with a feeling, a discomfort that can't really be answered because we can't really ever get there. We can do behavioral experiments, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But we really don't want to get too caught up in arguing. So, Ellie with your son, it may not be as helpful to really try to convince him that he's never going to become like this other person. But you can certainly speak to the fear that he has that he's experiencing with whatever thought he's having. Right? You can say, gosh, that's a really scary thought, but let's give it a try, right? Boy, that's a really scary thought, and I love you the way you are, and I would love you no matter what. And let's go through the door, right? So there can be these moments of encouragement and acknowledgement. We're never trying to say you're never going to be, lazy or a bad dresser, go bald, because we don't know, right? We can say the thought you're having, that sounds really scary, but we don't have any evidence of that. And also, maybe not in the moment, but there's a lot of evidence that you are who you are. And that story that's going through your mind about what may happen is just a story, right? One of the things that I've been doing a lot with my clients lately has been, before I move on to that, with the cognitive distortion element, and this is kind of what I'm touching on as well in very roundabout ways. There can be a delusional component to emotional contamination, right? The idea, we talked about it in magical thinking. We can call it delusional thinking, right? Delusion is a belief that you have that nobody else really has. So it's hard, if not impossible, to convince someone out of a delusion, to convince them that their thought is inaccurate, right? It's a firmly held belief and something that no one else believes, right? When we're working with that, to try to convince them is almost going to be an impossibility. So that's where really leaning into exposures and taking those risks and showing through experience and showing through taking risks and showing and building confidence that we are who we are, and that while we have that fear, the fear is unlikely to happen. The one thing that I've been doing a lot lately, and I know I talked about this on the last episode, has been, kind of talking about how, let's distance ourselves from the story, the content of this, and instead recognize how whatever the content is, content X inspires emotion Y. And I don't care what those things are, content X is triggering emotion Y. And the emotion Y is oftentimes going to be fear, anxiety, or discomfort, or uneasiness, or numbness, or whatever it might be. But what we're trying to do is to sit with this feeling and learn that we can have this feeling while we pursue our life, right? We're not trying to get caught up in convincing somebody, right? But instead, he wants to live his life again. And the avoidance of going through doors, the rumination on things, maybe the checking of things, whatever it might be, that's not who he wants to be. And he's doing all of this in the service of a thought that he has no guarantee or proof or evidence that it's going to happen. So, what do we want to do? Let's go live our life, kid, right? And to you, the person out there, the adult person out there who's not a kid, go out and live your life, whatever it might be. But go out and live your life despite this thought X, whatever thought X is, right? We talked about the car alarm example. The car alarm example is this, is that, car alarms can go off when a motorcycle goes by it, or when like a big, like percussive firework goes off. It can start car alarms going off, right? The car is not in danger. The car is going off because it perceived something, but it was way too sensitive and went off at an inappropriate time, right? But the car alarm is working, right? An individual who has an anxiety disorder has anxiety, which we should all have. But in this case, it's too sensitive. It's going off at a time that it ought not to be going off. It's going off too loudly when it doesn't need to be going off, or it's lasting way longer than it really needs to be. But it's going off way too sensitive. And it's going off way too sensitive in relation to subject X. It's going in relation to a thing that your brain has latched onto. I give the example of other people's fears in this, right? Like, I'll talk to people about earthquakes. We live in Southern California. Like, we live in Southern California, the land of earthquakes. Are you worried about the big one coming? I'm like, no. But it's possible, right? We've had big earthquakes in the past. People have died in earthquakes down here. Are you worried about one? No. Why not? I don't know, because I'm not. Do you want to die in an earthquake? No. Do you want your family members to die in an earthquake? No. But you're worried about this thing that you don't have any evidence of ever happening. Yes. What it really highlights is that OCD isn't really about the thought, because they'll tell themselves, and they've told you, and they've told everybody, that the thought is ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. It's inaccurate. It is unlikely. It is damn near impossible to happen. And yet they do the things anyways, and they do them at the service of the feeling. So it's a feeling problem, right? So the car alarm is going off, and it's annoying, and it's scary, and it's saying, I'm in danger, I'm in danger, I'm in danger of being broken into. That's what anxiety is doing. I'm in danger of becoming this bad person. I'm in danger of becoming not me, right? That's what the alarm is saying. So let's not talk about the content. Let's talk about that feeling, right? We get lost in the muck and the mire and the confusion of that narrative and the possibilities and the hearsays and the what ifs and the it's possibles, all that stuff. But when we sit with the feeling and recognize that despite the what ifs and the mire and the questioning, we can live and operate within that feeling. So that's the frame that we're trying to go with, is we're learning that we can have big old feelings and that we can continue to do what we want to do. Now, we can use that as a behavioral experiment as well, right? You can say, hey, you know what? It feels real uncomfortable. Let's take that big uncomfortable feeling with you. Let's not have the good thought, and let's just push through that door and let's see what happens, right? So I give this example before, and I know I do. So it's like I have a mug in the other room. It says poison across the front of it, right? It says poison on it. If I drink from the poison cup, am I going to die? People go, well, what's in the cup? Doesn't matter. It says poison. If I drink it, it says poison. Poison across the front. Wow, poison. If I take it, I'm going to die, right? Well, they go like, well, no. I go, how do you know? It says poison. They go, yes. But how do I know? How do I enter the cup? It could just say poison. They go, then you're not going to die. But it's you see where I can go with this, right? And this is what OCD does to us. Instead, I'm going to drink from the poison cup. I'm going to see what happens. If I die from the poison cup, well, there was poison in it. But what happens with OCD is that we push against it and nothing happens. We push against it. We do the opposite of what it tells us to do. We resist doing the compulsion and nothing happens. Now, all right, nothing happens. The vast majority of time, nothing happens, right? Sometimes, rarely, things happen. You touch your shoe or you eat, the proverbial you eat M&Ms or Skittles off a toilet seat. Sure, you could get sick. If you do driving exposures, you could get into a car accident. There could be an earthquake right now. But it's really unlikely. It's really unlikely. And we're learning to live with this unlikeliness. But again, one of the behavioral experiments you could do is be like, all right, you're worried you're going to become super lazy, you're going to learn to, or you're afraid you're going to be like Bob. Let's walk through the door and let's have a bad thought. You get on the other side of it and you go, are you more Bob-like? Are you Bobish today? Do you feel lazier? Do you feel angry? Do you feel like a less well-dressed person, right? Whatever that fear is. No? Oh, okay. Maybe next time. And through exposure, we do it over and over and over and over and over again. Not just that one time. We do it over and over and over again, and we learn that that thing is unlikely to happen. And we learn over time. Not that it's impossible, but that it's unlikely. Okay, I've yammered on enough. So let's get into what some exposures could look like, right? So one of the first things I want you to do, Ellie, or if you haven't done this, or if you've done this with a therapist or whatever it may be, we still want to make a hierarchy. The hierarchy is going to be all the things that trigger, right? What's trigger X? What triggers that feeling, right? It could be colors or places or people or names or items or behaviors or buildings or things like that. We also want to put down what are the compulsions surrounding those things, right? Avoiding, it's going to be washing. It might be washing my clothes. It might be taking my clothes off right when I get home and washing them and putting on my safe clothes when I get home and making sure that I go in and touch my bedroom doorknob 3 times just to make sure that I'm not going to become like Bob, right? So all the things, and then you rank them from easiest, like if you were to do the thing without doing the compulsion, how anxious would you be? And you want to put it from easiest to hardest, and we're going to start with the easiest ones and start working up, right? So it can be a lot of stuff, right? So we first want to start by cutting out compulsive behavior. That's the most important thing. If you were to do anything, cut out compulsions rather than just doing, if you were to do exposures while still doing compulsions, you're not helping, right? It's like trying to lose weight, going to the gym, but then going and eating McDonald's 5 times a day, right? You're defeating the purpose. All right. So you say that he can be around people, but he still gets really stuck, right? So I think that's where being intentional and being consistent about doing exposures on a regular basis is going to be incredibly helpful, all right? So I'll give you an example of what an exposure building up might look like with this. So you said, he's afraid of walking through doors. Well, maybe we're going to practice just walking through doors and thinking the letter of that person's first name, right? So maybe it's a B, right? All right, we're going to think B as we walk through the door. B, 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 B. And practice doing that. And then maybe we're going to add the second letter to it. And eventually, as he gets more and more comfortable doing that, maybe we'll expand it to the full name. Now, by the way, even before all of this, I might just practice writing the letter B if the name is Bob. I'm just going to practice doing that over and over and over again until that becomes easy, until I can write the word. And then we're going to practice pairing that with some action that he's afraid of. So that's where the doors can come in, right? We're walking through doors. After we do the full name, we might do a mental image of that person, right? But we might go through the door while saying the name, right? So all of this slowly builds on itself. And this can be extended to almost any action that is going to be related to that person or make one feel that anxiety. Remember, our target isn't to be like Bob. The target is to bring on that feeling and to learn that we can have this feeling, the feeling is safe, and that we can still live our life despite feelings, despite the discomfort that comes with anxiety. Remember, it's an anxiety disorder, right? It is anxiety happening out of order. It's happening way too much. The car alarm is working out of order. You get the idea. All right. So you also need to incorporate, I would say, more exposures on a day-to-day basis in other areas of one's life. right? So I like environmental exposures. I know I've talked about those before. And environmental exposures prevent someone from living their life without encountering their exposure, without encountering their trigger, right? So for this, it might be taking Post-it notes. And I've got Post-it notes everywhere, I'm telling you. You take Post-it notes, write that person's name on it, and put them everywhere. They're in the room. They're in the lunchbox. They're in their car. They're on their desk at work. Right? They might be changing the background of their phone or the background of their computer to that person's face. So they're constantly going to be seeing this person, right? If it's a color, we're going to wear that color as often as we possibly can, right? We're going to do actions, listen to music, incorporate this as much as we can into that person's life. And yes, it will be uncomfortable, but again, we're disengaging from the trigger, disengaging from arguing with the trigger and proving or disproving. Because again, I don't care what the trigger is. We're using it as X. It is Mad Libs. It is whatever that thing is that brings on the feeling. We're trying to lift the heavy weight of the feeling, whatever that feeling is that day. The more we lift it, the stronger we get. The more we can go up to a heavier weight and lift that weight until we get stronger, until we can move up to a heavier weight, until sooner or later we are at our ideal, right? I know that's generous, but you get what I'm saying, right? We're building this mastery to have this feeling and to engage life without compulsion. So, as I mentioned, Ellie, earlier in this episode, one thing you can really do is offer that encouragement. We want to speak to that feeling, especially when it gets stuck, right? Hey, this is really scary. I know this is really hard. Gosh, you've been practicing this a lot, and you've been super good at being able to challenge that obsession and to ignore that obsession and continue to be you. And let's go and do it, right? And you can even say, like, hey, let's sit here for a minute, or let's count to 10, and let's go do it. Let's go through that door. Right? And you can ask him and work through, what's going to be encouraging to him. But really, we're trying to pull back on reassurances that everything's going to be okay. And instead, really building on his confidence and willingness to do the opposite of what OCD is telling him to do. Recognizing that giving into that obsession has gotten in the way of the life that he wants. So the more he pushes into it, the more he's going to have his life. And after the end of it, you're going to really celebrate it. It's going to be a big stinking deal. And you got it. That was amazing. And it was, and it is. So, Ellie, I hope this has been helpful to kind of give you an idea. To everybody out there who's new to emotional contamination, I hope this has been helpful in giving you kind of a rough overview of what treatment could look like and how it works. And I know I didn't really talk about ACT that much. I didn't really talk about ICBT that much. Those are all individual things that we could talk about, or other individual avenues that can be really helpful. Go check them out if you're interested in it. But if you have further suggestions for Ellie or further encouragement for Ellie, send it to me over at fearcastpodcast.com. If you have further questions, message me over there or via Instagram. But until next time, everybody, take a risk, challenge yourself, and don't take your brain too seriously. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Fearcast. If you would like your question answered on a future episode, please click on the Submit a Question link at fearcastpodcast.com. If you would like your question answered sooner, please send me a recording of your question to questions@fearcastpodcast.com, or by sending me an audio message through Instagram by DMing me at fearcastpodcast on Instagram. If you like the Fearcast, please write a review on your podcast platform of choice. Please remember that the Fearcast is not a substitute for psychotherapy. If you need a little bit of help in your recovery, please go over to fearcastpodcast.com and click on the Find Help link, and there's going to be some information for you there. So until next time, take a risk, challenge yourself, and don't take your brain too seriously. Bye.